Okay, folks, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming out. People will be coming and going throughout the day. I think we have about 75 registrants, and so people will come and go as they want, and that's sort of the way we plan, particularly the morning sessions. So I'm Dr. Jay Antle. I am the Executive Director of the Johnson County Community College Center for Sustainability, and this is our 5th or 6th annual Epicenter Conference. Where we deal with a different topic regarding sustainability every year. This year we are going to be talking about stories and science. And I think that's a really important topic for the moment. We, as human beings, one thing that differentiates us from the rest of the animal kingdom is that we in fact tell stories. And those stories communicate not only data, they communicate meaning, they communicate values. And so part of what we'll be talking about today is the way that we tell stories in the modern world. Do those storytelling techniques serve us very well when we're talking about science or things like climate change or the Anthropocene, that somewhat contested term of the modern era we're in, where that separation between nature and culture is no longer separate. It's no longer viable. And that duality between nature and culture gets us to, I think, this issue again of storytelling. If your stories are predicated upon an idea that nature and culture are separate, but in reality, we as human beings are changing what nature is, does that duality make much sense anymore in the way that we tell stories? So these are the kinds of challenges that our speakers will enthusiastically, right? That's where you guys nod. Yeah. Thank you. Rise to the occasion, and will lead us through their own experiences and their own answers to these kinds of questions. And one other point that is important as well is in our modern media world, do we have tools of mass communication that allow us to tell stories that are more useful in these complicated times? Okay, so enough of me prattling on, although I will say one thing more about housekeeping. The first 2 sessions will be in here, and then our lunch and the workshop with the folks from the Alan Alda Center will be in CapFed 101. So for those of you who are wondering where you're going to be when, that's how all that's going to break down. Okay, so now in terms of breaking down, I'm now going to break down Andy Revkin's biography. Did you like that? I'm trying to warm this crowd up here, and
you did a great job.
Thank you. See, there you go. See, when you act pathetic and sad, people respond, and so at least I'm able to do that. It's worked well for me in the classroom for many years. All right, so our opening speaker is Andy Revkin, and I'm using your altered ProPublica bio here, so we'll see if you like what they say about you. He used to work at ProPublica, and you worked for them for a little over a year and a half, 2 years? 1 year. After working for the New York Times for over 21 years, most recently through the .Earth blog. And he also spent 6 years, we talked about this last night, at teaching at Pace University, working on a program dealing with interdisciplinary education regarding sustainability, which was then eventually absorbed by a discipline, which is what tends to happen in higher education, sadly. Everybody loves interdisciplinary until a discipline grabs something, and that's the way it works. He's certainly well known for his works in science journalism, won a number of awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, Columbia University's John Chancellor Award. I remember John Chancellor. Who in here remembers John Chancellor? Okay, good. About a third of you. All right, for sustained journalistic excellence, and of course has won awards for a variety of articles dealing with investigative reporting. He's written books on global warming and changing Arctic, and he has a new book out about connections, great weather moments in history. Is that sort of the tagline for it? And being a storm chaser myself, I'm very excited to read his new book. Revkin, of course, as some of you, as some of you may know, has also been a performing songwriter, and for 20 years was a frequent accompanist of Pete Seeger, for those of you who know that name. And how many of you know Pete Seeger? A few more than John Chancellor. All right, and there is a guitar up here, and so Andy can play guitar. He's not afraid to do that, so we'll see what happens. All right, so Andy's going to talk to us about storytelling and climate change and his experiences in the media world. And so with that, I'm going to get out of the way and introduce to you Andy Revkin.
Thank you. Hold on a second. It's really great to be here. I was in this vicinity a couple of years ago to speak at KU, but mainly to be at the Folk Alliance meeting, which was a stunning experience, like 5,000 folkies in a Sheraton. Yeah, it was truly mind-blowing. I want to do a film about it someday. But I'm here to talk about this question. This is my 30th year writing about global warming, greenhouse gas-driven climate change, which is kind of hard for me to believe. And I had a strong misperception of what it was when it was emerging. I think now the world is slowly coming to grips with a different storyline for this phenomenon than we thought it was. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of that and what to do about it, because it's kind of, when something's bigger than you think, it can bum you out, but I think it's actually an opportunity. So, my reporting, being a journalist is like a gift if you are interested in the world, because at least in the old days, when there were budgets, you got to go places and see things and try to explain them to people who would never see them. And for me, it's been everywhere from the North Pole, and that was the North Slope of Alaska in midwinter. I don't recommend, have a virtual view of that. Don't go there in midwinter. I was at the Vatican for a meeting in 2014 on the sustainable humanity, sustainable planet, our responsibility. And we spent a week talking about those questions, and it really should have had a question mark at the end. So it's not a selfie when someone else is taking the picture, but this is like my Pope quasi-selfie. And it's been the Amazon, it's been an amazing experience. And now I'm at National Geographic Society. That's the brand new thing. I started there 7 weeks ago. I'm at the society is the nonprofit part. The important thing for you to know is they give out grants. There's now $1.2 billion in the endowment of National Geographic. It was an aging, shrinking thing, and now it's a big thing. And they're grants for conservation, for research, for education, for storytelling, for technology, like critter cams, aimed at three things: the human journey, changing planet, and wildlife. So there's a grant for you somewhere in there. And there's early career grants, anyone over 18. So we'll get to that in a second. I can't resist talking about that. And I recently, the book that I wrote is really it's our human learning journey in considering weather and climate. And there's a big moment now in that long journey, which has been all through the history of our species. And I'm going to talk about the shape of that moment. Why it's been hard. It's not just as simple as a denier-believer thing. And we'll talk about that too. So, and here's one way to think of it. In assembling these 100 moments in our relationship with weather and climate, essentially, that's 1927 in Vermont, amazing flood. It was worse than anything in the current era, and there have been floods like that because of paleoclimate studies for thousands of years. And then on the left, of course, this is the Dust Bowl. That's my old band playing It Has Been So Dry. So nearly all of our history, climate did stuff to us. It was a one-way thing. You either moved, adapted, figured out what clothes are, fire was a big deal, or you died. And so now, it's a two-way relationship. It's an emergent two-way relationship. And we're just kind of now absorbing the reality that we are changing that system. And a lot of what you hear about the current events being the thing to be concerned about or to focus on is kind of oversimplified because of that historic pattern of lots of extreme stuff. And so that's why it's a cloudy, murky, contentious picture. You can see here, this is the warming signal in recent decades, and it feels like when you have that, then you know that greenhouse gases have a fundamental warming impact on the atmosphere. And then we have a flood. That's also Vermont in 2012.
I don't like that at all. Oh my God.
A 200-year-old bridge goes away, and you think, oh my God, this is global warming. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. And every aspect of this problem this thing called global warming is not that simple. And that's why the story that we've created around it, the stories, tend to be caricatures of what's real. So as I said, I've been writing about humans and climate since the 80s. I'm an old person. That's half of my life. I just turned 62 in March. And I first wrote about nuclear winter, which was the idea during the Cold War that if we burned enough cities in a nuclear war, not only would the war be horrific, but the aftermath would cause famine because the atmosphere would be full of so much smoke and reflective particles that ecosystems would be disrupted, nuclear winter. And I learned a big lesson there because it was, it turned out that some other scientists studied it. Oh, I just got to set the clock here so I don't go too long. They really, they did some more work on it and they realized it was more like nuclear autumn. Steve Schneider and some other climate scientists. But where's your headline in nuclear autumn? What would a cover be like? Nuclear autumn. After a nuclear war, we'd have a nuclear autumn. And science, one of the big lessons for me as a science writer was that demonstrated that more science doesn't always make something simpler. More science, as more people dig in on a stark initial idea, often it becomes more nuanced. And what does that mean? It means it leaves the public discourse because it's more boring. And that's kind of one of our problems. So it's really kind of, and here, just to show you how things change, you know, this was 1988. And my cover story ran in a magazine. I got this on eBay recently. And so I'd had a scan of it for decades, but I hadn't had the whole magazine. And that's when I realized there's a tobacco ad in a science magazine. And what that says to me, when I think about my own learning journey, there was a time when I worked at a science magazine where it was unremarkable to have cigarette ads paying your bill. And the other thing, when you go back through the history of our relationship with climate or other matters, you realize that the cultural context of a time can really shape your impression of the problem. For example, Arrhenius, the Swedish chemist who first figured out how much warming you might get from burning a lot of coal, in 1896, when he wrote about it in 1906 in a book on global change, that's in my book too. He thought it was going to be great because he was from Sweden. It was the Industrial Revolution at its booming moment. And he said, you know, more warming, better crop production. And then only from the 50s onward did we emerge more science. And also, you know, we had an environmental movement more generally. And that led to this deeper concern about the consequences of it weren't necessarily all super duper. So at the same time, you know, when I was writing in those days, back in the 80s, 90s, it was this model. When I went to the New York Times, the magazines, it was authoritarian. It was the voice of Walter Cronkite. He was the John Chancellor competitor. And how did he end his broadcast every night?
That's the way it is.
That's the way it is. Tuesday, November 5th, 1982. And so we didn't have to do any work. You, the news consumer. 40 million people in America every night had spaghetti and mac and cheese or whatever, and it was all doled out by this avuncular guy who told you the state of the world. And the magazines and newspapers kind of had that authority kind of approach to news. And I came to the New York Times, and it was like that. I learned a lot about this ecosystem and what happens when something happens in the world, and how does it get on the front page. It's kind of like there's a newsroom ecosystem, and you know, you're competing with Wall Street's news and something like Trump says, and with an earthquake, and then you're telling your editor, oh, you know, now we know that Greenland's ice cap is melting twice as fast as we thought. And the first reaction is, well, didn't we already write about Greenland? It's like, okay, no, it's different, it's bigger. So that was becoming a frustrating part of that aspect of things. And meantime, you know, you have an expectation as a science writer, well, you know, if you just write better, or if activists just make more noise or are more clever in their campaigns, we'll change this thing. We did it with the Clean Air Act. You know, here the states and England, after the 1952 great smog in England, they had their Clean Air Act push before ours. And the Montreal Protocol, it was like just before 1988. We had this treaty to solve this other global environmental problem. So we all kind of thought, well, this one will be like that. We'll just pass a treaty and go forward. And it's turned out, you know, we're in zoom mode on this planet. And this is the cumulative, this is the Keeling curve, which now has its own Twitter account, which is cool. it's CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So this is actually the amount of the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is rising. The emissions rates rising at this as well. It's like a filling bathtub. And that says to you, as a science writer, I'm going to skip that one, what's going on here? So it's not like, it felt like it wasn't like an environmental problem like we used to think. And that's when, if you step back further, you look at these trends of us. This is the International Geophysical Biosphere, IGBP. They did this project in 2015 that showed you that basically all the curves of us have the same kind of trajectory with some modulation and changes: fertilizer consumption, stratospheric ozone content, shrimp aquaculture. Look at that one. Boom. And that's actually, that can be a good thing or it can be really bad, depending on how it's done. And that says to you, well, maybe something about this CO2 curve is not, if we think of this as just a climate problem, we're missing the story. And we talked about, you heard about the Anthropocene. In 1992, I wrote this, my first book on climate, had a line about that. Like I said, basically, I sort of predicted the Anthropocene, which was kind of cool. And that's, so then how do you solve that? Is that a problem to solve? When you look at this, you look at the strength of this surge, much of which was enabled by energy. It feels like it's a different kind of thing. And I took this picture of the 2009 climate talks in Copenhagen in the press room when we all felt like that. And everyone thought, oh my God, this thing's just falling apart. And everyone who's worked on the sustainability, one of those curves has had this feeling one time or another. And the media part of this, I think, also got really frustrating for me. As I started to see how what I used to call the tyrannies of the newsroom would torque the story. So you have the torquing of the story, you have the missing of the story, the much bigger story, and there's a third element. I can, if you just search for tyrannies and news and Revkin online, you can get more on that. And what happened was I started to change my journalism. I started to move from that output mode to listening mode. And this is the key thing I want to mention to you, is that I moved progressively from the idea that progress can come through telling a better story to having a better conversation, meaning listening to your readers, listening to other experts, getting out of your bubble. And it started for me when I went to the North Pole in 2003. No one said, Andy, bring a video camera. But I was going to go to the North Pole for the New York Times on the sea ice. The water is 14,000 feet deep and the ice is making all that noise. And if I hadn't told the story that way,
you can feel the chunk that we're on actually starting to fail a bit more. Probably hairline cracks up the towards the helos there.
So does that mean we should back up?
Not yet. You can always jump over a crack.
Remember that when you go to the pool. And still there, I still had this expectation that, well, if I just do this multimedia stuff, then that's the way forward. And then I kept running into these problems. I created .earth in 2007 as a way to interrogate the question of that whole big surge on almost a daily basis. And so my blog wasn't about the environment. It was about the question, how do we head through 9 billion people with the fewest regrets? It was an open question because the complexity of the problem seemed finally to have gotten to me. And it didn't fit. How do you tell that in a conventional news story? I couldn't find a way to do that. But having a running conversation felt right. But then you hit this. Whatever your issue is, whether it's agriculture practices or energy options, nuclear, renewable, or whatever your thing is, this is what you get online. Unfortunately, think about the Walter Cronkite comfort food meal we all had, and then think about this. You're still having comfort food, but it's your comfort food. Like whoever you are, you'll find your meal now online, and you'll be in your bubble, and it'll feel kind of nice, but you won't be realizing that there's this big world out there with different views. And it got pretty caricatured, both on both ends. The snowball throwing Senator Inhofe, And this was a picture that environmentalists sent around the internet a while back, very similar to that recent video clip that was of the starving polar bear. This was a drowning polar bear meme. And the problem with it was it became quickly evident that this polar bear was not struggling because he was drowning. He was pissed off because the helicopter from which the picture was taken was about 200 feet overhead, and all the waves you see there from the helicopter downwash. So the picture became the story, not the changing Arctic. And that's the danger of this online environment. And then, of course, just TMI, too much information. And all of this caused me, as I'm approaching my sort of middle years, and you start to think, do I want to spend the next 20 years writing about climate change? Or what do I do? And that's where I started to think, and I use this term, I'm trying to think, it's like when you're captured by a narrative, and I had been, as a journalist for a long time, captured by the idea this was a political problem, a technological problem, and every time I really dug in on those aspects of it, I realized, no, it's something different. And that led me to, well, if you want to learn more, just here's a URL. You can read a long essay I wrote about how it changed me even more. So the communication itself had its limits. And here's one of the other aspects of the world I hadn't fully absorbed, which is I use the word we a lot. Anyone who speaks about these issues uses we. We need to decarbonize. We need to pass a climate treaty. We need a carbon tax. But the more you look around the world, you realize when it comes to energy and climate, there is no we. I spent time in India last year looking at cooking practices and the pollution from them. And what this woman needs is propane, LPG, for sure. It's been known by science since the 90s that you have a clean fuel burning cleanly and efficiently. It's actually got a lower carbon footprint than these biomass stoves that have been offered in the place of a simple, primitive cooking apparatus. And my sister has this super duper, ultra efficient small apartment in New York City. New York City is like the lowest carbon footprint around, and she doesn't even fly a lot, so she's like, great. But there's something very different about their needs and interests in energy. And that makes it hard to have a climate treaty or for us to sort of press India to think about not using coal for electricity. I was in Singapore and Nairobi in 2016, speaking of air miles, and that's when I really had this profound realization of this thing I had written about 10 years earlier in the Times, a big series on climate divide, that if you have wealth in technology, you're very much insulated from climate risk. Singapore has this Gardens by the Bay. Has anybody been there? It's wild. It's the world's biggest enclosed botanical gardens. And there's one there that's it's like Mediterranean world. You walk in there, it's like a museum of climates. As long as Singapore has money and technology, you can experience a Mediterranean climate on the equator, 88 miles from the equator. And I spent time in a slum in Nairobi, and you just see that they need energy and all that, the amenities that come with it more than they need to worry about climate. And I'm going to fast forward here. So the other thing I learned, and the biggest mistake I think I made my whole career was that the first 20 years of my writing about climate change was very mechanical, very scientific. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It's changing the warming of the world. That has impacts on everything, et cetera. And then I got into the psychology around 2006. I wrote a piece called Yelling Fire on a Hot Planet. And it was just, why is everybody so angry? Around that time, 2005, 2006. And I talked to scientists, including Dan Kahane, who has he does work he calls cultural cognition, where he studies, we have these filters, just like the filter bubble online, that totally torque how we perceive information. So the same people, different people will see the same information fundamentally differently. And the best single illustration of that is John Sutter, who's a friend, CNN journalist. In 2015, he went to Woodward County, Oklahoma, which Yale survey had identified as the most skeptical county in America on global warming, like that county. There's error bars in these studies and stuff, but you get the idea. It's the oil patch. If you think that this cultural cognition issue is just about concerns for climate or not climate, I want to take you to two friends of mine. Bill McKibben and Jim Hansen. I've known Bill, he started writing about climate change basically the same year I did. His book came out, The End of Nature, in 1989. And they've chained themselves to the same fences outside of the White House and some coal companies. But if you look at what Jim Hansen has said about the solution, he was very critical of those who pursue a renewable, all renewable future. He wrote a piece a few years ago where, in his estimation, if you believe rapid renewable energy deployment can get to the scale that would be meaningful on climate change, you also believe in the tooth fairy. This is Jim Hansen. His solution is very focused on nuclear technology. And Bill McKibben is about small and dispersed and renewable. But they still chain themselves to the same fences. You don't hear that backstory, but what that says to me is it's important to somehow figure out how to have a tolerance for a diverse array of solutions. And I don't know how that happens, because if your agenda is rapid renewables, how do you acknowledge that everyone else's agenda has some place in the landscape too? And when I go to campuses or when I've talked to people, I was very lucky to be able to spend an hour with Bill Gates. I did a video interview that you can find online of me. And he's all about the big breakthrough, and 20 years from now, one of his investments in nuclear will pay off. And he's working on geoengineering. And then this young duo are PhD physicists from MIT who have started a company called Transatomic Power. And should I feel that they have any less of a role going forward than the activists I've met over the decades at climate talks? I think it's all part of this stew that we are. And I was thinking about this a lot when thinking about the divisive nature of our discussions. And I was Googling. This is around the time of the Keystone debate. And I was Googling for words like environmental threat, response, diversity. I just wanted to know, has anyone, like sociologists, has anyone studied environmental movements and the value of diversity? And I found this ecosystem paper from 2003 by Thomas Elmquist. I've been in touch with him since. The diversity of responses to environmental change among species contributing to the same function, we'll call it response diversity, is critical to resilience. Response diversity is particularly important for ecosystem renewal and reorganization following change. And as I was reading this paper, I was thinking, just sort of substitute the word social or society for ecosystem. And it felt like it has a lot of resonance for why the human journey, with some tweaking, with the capacity for diverse responses to a problem, is that's a good thing. It's taken us a long way so far as a species, but of course a lot of things are cutting against this right now. The filter bubble, the power of polarization, cultural cognition. So it takes work, but I think it's the path forward. I'm just going to end with this one. One thing I found really useful on the climate problem is to break it into pieces. Vulnerability to climate hazards is implicit. It's not political. Libertarians, just like the guy who likes solar power, I've met many limited government conservatives and libertarians who hate that we subsidize flood insurance so that people end up in harm's way and repetitively get bailed out for it using taxpayer money. And you can have a conversation with people in that camp about vulnerability reduction who it would be a harder conversation to hold if it was climate-centered, climate change-centered. And then energy, as I say here, pursuing energy choices that work for the long haul is another conversation you can have. That is something that, if it's not cast in the context of what's become an uber politicized issue, can be constructive conversation. When I point to these pictures from around Baton Rouge, I wrote about the floods there a couple years ago. This house was built almost 200 years ago. And look how it was built. Hey, it floods here. That house was built 30 or 40 years ago, and look what happened. And I can talk about that with anybody, whatever their political orientation, and we could think of ways to address that problem. And again, keep in mind that climate science shows clearly that there's no quick change in climate patterns. If we shut down every motor and power plant on Earth, stopped flying and stopped everything, it would take decades for the system to notice that. So this is a conversation to have in real time, and the energy one is a different one to have, and that can then start to lead to progress. And I think I'm going to leave it there just to avoid overload. So even Bill McKibben, I'll just say this, even Bill McKibben, his language is urgent. He wrote this piece for the New Republic last year on carbon. We need to have a war on carbon. But when I talk to young people particularly, I say, don't just listen to his words, look at his life. He gets up every morning and he's found this sort of adaptive, creative way to keep pursuing his vision of what we do. And his least famous book is this book about the year he spent learning to be a long-distance skier. So he's like the marathon skier of climate advocacy. He just keeps on going. And I have my approach and I keep on going. And that's kind of the way to go, I think, going forward. One last thing I got to fit it into. The Vatican, that meeting of the Vatican, what was really valuable about it was a place where there were plenty of scientists, and they expressed their values and their concerns about the science. But they found a way to set aside, this is what the science I do, here are my findings, and here's what I feel. And that's a really important opportunity for scientists who feel kind of fearful of being in the public eye. Because if you you're allowed to be a person, but it's good to do it in 2 sentences. Same thing for journalists. So I'm going to leave it there. I am going to, if I have time, let's see. Yeah. So, to me, multimedia includes this. I write songs. Most of my songs are not about environmental issues. But my wife spent time in Boulder in the 90s, and they had a spring flash flood, a very damaging one. And it just stuck me in my head as something worth a song. So this is called The Flood. It was June up in the Rockies, sun was beating down. Deep snow fields were melting fast, creeks ran wild and brown. Streams all joined together in a once-in-a-lifetime roar. No problem, said the engineers. Those dams can handle more. Meanwhile, way down in the tourist towns, like always, life was good. Some merchants printed T-shirts saying, I survived the flood. But a thunderstorm was building like no one could recall. Black anvil clouds, they rose so high, they made those Rockies small. They say that nature has a habit of cleaning up mistakes. Don't build a town on a mountainside unless you like high stakes. The wind howled like a wounded wolf, Niagara Falls it rained. Oh, geez, sorry. Wind howled like a wounded wolf, Niagara Falls it rained. Down in thundering canyons, the dams began to strain. I was up late. Those engineers were sweating now as they tapped computer keys. Their worst case calculations looked like reality. And the people building condos and driving 4x4s and playing golf on perfect greens and shopping fancy stores. They never knew what hit them until it was too late. A freight train wall of water, it wiped clean their whole slate. They say that nature has a habit of cleaning up mistakes. Don't build a town on a mountainside unless you like high stakes. Storm rolled east all through the night, flood waters ebbed away. As first light hit the Rockies, the townsfolk were amazed. The mountains gleam like silver, malls and condos gone. The people smiled, some embraced. The world, it looked newborn. They say that nature has a habit of cleaning up mistakes. Well, don't build a town on a mountainside unless You like high stakes. Thank you. So anyone, use whatever you got. If there's time for a question or two, we can do that, or not. If there's time for a question or two.
Okay, so we have time for some questions. And so we have this device, which we can actually
I'll
throw
let you throw it.
across the room. Apparently, liability folks have cleared us to do this, and so here we go. So you have a question, and by the way, it must be a question. It must not be no comments. And if the question goes on more than a minute and a half, I will take this away from you. So there you go.
What do you think of regenerative agriculture as a potential solution?
Regenerative ag. It's in the mix. I was just at a meeting 2 days ago with a bunch of people working on that. There's a Capital Institute. There's a website I could click to. The carbon value is still in question in many ways. This is what practices you can use, including with livestock, to maximize carbon uptake and to basically regenerate soil, to grow soil while you're growing crops. And, it needs a lot of work. By the way, one of the we're so underinvested in basic R&D in energy. One of the things I wrote about for a long time, but even in ag as well. Those basic studies of soils and carbon and blue carbon. This is marshes and salt marshes and wetlands, coastal ocean carbon. Really important. Anything else?
I speak on climate change in the developing world, and a lot of times it's hard you just keep giving people kind of bad news and they'll shut down after a while. How do you leaven that up to kind of keep people from shutting down?
Well, I focus on the thing, these studies of paleoclimate records have been really valuable to me as a journalist. You think studying past climate seems so irrelevant when you're a reporter dealing with today's risks. But in 2009 in Ghana, there was an amazing study of a lake there where they have a multi-thousand-year record of past year to year. Actually, it's actually multi-month record of climate patterns, weather, heavy rain. And they've had mega droughts there, 100-year mega droughts, bigger than anything in the modern historical record, that are in that system. And nobody really understands what combination of ocean circulation changes lead to those. And climate models for that part of Africa are still equivocal about whether it's going to get wetter or drier going forward in a warming world. So to me, that leads back to the basic thing right there. The things you work on are energy access and water management. You don't know it's going to be a mega drought. The next one that starts, if it's all climate change meaning global warming, it's even odds whether you're even right. And at the same time, the vulnerability there is building enormously because of high fertility rates. So when I write about Nigeria, you see that Nigeria could have 800 million people in it by 2080, or 300 million, depending on little tweaks in fertility rates. So what do you work on? Getting girls through high school. That's the one thing that has the most chance of moderating that thing. And when you take a sort of step-by-step approach to these issues like that, you suddenly see that something that most environmentalists would never say, we need to get girls through high school in Nigeria. And by the way, what that means is you have to deal with Boko Haram extremists. So dealing with Boko Haram, which is trying to kidnap girls going to high school, is actually a sustainability strategy for Nigeria. But no one's making that point. So just find the thing, and then I think you can do it.
I have a group of students in here that are in an environmental ethics class. And Monday we were talking about a Bill McKibben article that was written 20 years ago, A Special Moment in History. And so we were having a conversation. In the article, McKibben talks about us being on a new Earth, that's different than the Earth we were born into. But for many of these students, they were born onto this Earth. So we were talking about, was that special moment 20 years ago? Is it still, right? Are we part of that moment today? Are we in a new moment? Yeah. Can you comment a little bit on that for my students?
Yeah, I thought so. I've thought a long time, and a lot of my rhetoric was similar to that. But I think now, actually in doing the book, which is this whole, it's everything from Well, it goes all the way back through the history of our understanding of the system. And you realize it's an emergent idea that we are in a two-way relationship with climate. That means it's brand new. On human timescales, even on human timescales, which are tiny, as Carl Sagan would point out, this is a new idea. And it's come around just as we've been in surge mode. And I remember what I said about Arrhenius, where in 1896, the guy who identified a lot of warming from burning a lot of coal thought it was good. And that was his norm for that moment in history. And 20 years ago, I think our norm was to perceive this as like what we did in the 20th century with smog and CFCs. And the more I've looked at it, one of my privileges has been to interrogate this question from every vantage point possible. Ethics at the Vatican, technology and solar labs and nuclear facilities, and talking to movement makers like Bill. And I do think that what has happened is this emergent property of the human journey right now is not really explicable. And it's certainly not manageable. In my book on 1992 on climate change, I quoted Matthew Fontaine Maury, who was the first oceanographer, American naval oceanographer in the 1850s. And he wrote this beautiful essay in his book about the responsibility, the responsible mariner needs to manage this system. And that word manage has rung in my head. It's in my book in 1992. I quoted him. And I think what we're talking about more is identifying, clarifying, and addressing a risk that's on a much different timescale. It's like the difference between, well, solving a problem has that implicit sense of there's a discrete solution. And this is more like managing an emerging risk that we didn't really know was there, and now it's here. Even if it wasn't human caused, I think a good exercise is to think of this, do a thought experiment with the class where it's not us. Perhaps it's just some emergent property of something that's generating a lot of greenhouse gases. And look at it just in that way and say, well, how would we address that? And the human element is just that energy matters to us more than long-term climate security. It's all about ethics. How much do you care about the future? How much do you care about neighbors on the other side of the world? People who are the same species, and they're more vulnerable to climate than we are. Those are questions of values. They're not questions that science will answer. And that's the other thing. So I think that is the prime discussion. But then even if you have that ethical construct, then you say, well, what do I do? And that's where, if you search for Revkin and Serenity Prayer on Google, that's where I've written about this, where I came up with like an agnostic version of the Serenity Prayer, which is basically, know what you can change, know what you can't, know the difference, and work on the things you can. And science helps to do that. Science helps you discriminate what you can't change and what you can work on. But it doesn't tell you what to do, and that's where the good part of that is that in a variegated problem, everyone can do something. But don't expect to solve it. It's like the American Cancer Society knows it's not going to solve cancer. The Department of Education, theoretically, at least right now, isn't going to make education perfect tomorrow. These are emergent things you work on. And most of our modern agencies in government didn't exist 40 or 50 years ago. They emerged. And there's not going to be a Department of Climate, but we have a FEMA, and we have all this structure for dealing with hazard. That's a conversation that can be had. So the hazard thing can work out. The energy thing is hard. And that, even Bill Gates, when I had that conversation with Bill, he's so much about the breakthrough thing, but he was not even dealing with the need for innovation at the village scale. There's another guy in that picture I showed, Harish Hande, who's a solar entrepreneur in India, who's figured out how to go into a village, do a sort of an energy audit, and figure out a way with renewable energy to make their lives better as a starting point toward progress. And that's just as important to me as the Bill Gates. But how do we foster a conversation that's around all those things? That's the question.
We have time for one last question.
One of the slides that you had showed some contrasting images of homes built higher than like flood level. And 18 years ago, I went to Cape Hatteras, where a lot of homes are built up high. And my question is really, why aren't more coastal cities, coastal areas, or even river areas built, or have residential homes certainly, built higher than, say, you know,
It can
that's
cost
kind
more.
of just it. Why don't people just build higher, you know?
It can cost more, and I've been in areas where I wrote about Hurricane Ivan, 2004, in Louisiana, where I was interviewing homeowners who had houses on stilts that had gotten washed away in a Category 5 storm, and they knew their check was coming. They weren't like freaked out. It wasn't like one of the, I expect them to be devastated. And it was more like, oh, we're going to rebuild, and, to build back bigger. And that was, oh my God. So that's part of it. And cities are a really interesting challenge right now. At National Geographic, one of the priorities for funding is grants to look at how do you make a city, a coastal city, resilient and able to handle one of the big uncertainties in climate change, which is how fast sea levels are going to rise. It's still highly unclear. And so that's a real great opportunity for innovators, planners, and architects to be thinking about. But there's lots of impediments there too. And if you search for sea level Revkin coastal city, you'll find a lot of stuff about that as well.
Yeah, and for those of you who are on campus, on Thursday we're going to be reading a couple of chapters out of a new book called The Water Will Come, and this issue is one of those things that's addressed there. If you would like a copy of the readings, if you're here on campus, contact
sustainability@jcc.edu.
All right, so
By the way, just so you know, that house is on the shoreline of the Hudson River where I am, and it's a part of the river that's tidal. It's an arm of the sea. And it's built by an architect who's a passive house guy, so it's super low energy. And the bottom floor is built to flood. It replaced a place that was chronically flooding. And the woman, we walk our dogs right there every day, so I got to know her really well. So you can do this stuff. You can do this. And there's a regional network of passive house evangelists. And at that scale, lots is doable.
Yeah. Okay, so let's give Andy another round of applause.